The lawyer's voice was calm, almost too calm for what he was about to say. "Mr. Harlow," he said, sliding a single sheet of paper across his desk toward me, "I think you need to read this again. The whole thing, not just the first page." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say. I'd already read it. My wife, my Patricia, had been gone less than 2 weeks, and I'd sat in that same office, in that same chair, and listened to every word of her will being read aloud. I thought I knew what it said. I didn't know anything. Patricia and I had been married for 38 years. We built everything together, the two of us, starting with nothing except a small plumbing supply business her father left her when he passed. I worked that business like it was my own child. Drove the delivery truck myself for the first 4 years. Kept the books on weekends. When the housing boom hit Ontario in the early 90s, we were ready for it, and by the time our daughter Ivy was in high school, we had 12 employees and 2 locations. We weren't wealthy the way people think of wealthy. We weren't flying to Monaco or buying vacation homes in Florida, but we had a good house in Burlington, a solid RRSP, and a portfolio that Patricia had quietly, carefully grown over 20 years with the help of a financial advisor she trusted more than she trusted most people. When she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 4 years ago, we sat at the kitchen table and talked about everything. The house, the accounts, what would happen. I told her to make sure Ivy was taken care of. I said that without really thinking about what it meant. Patricia just looked at me for a long moment, the way she used to look at me when she knew something I didn't, and said, "Don't worry, Hugh. I've thought about this more than you know." I should have asked her what she meant by that. I didn't. Ivy was 41 when her mother died. She'd married a man named Spencer 12 years ago, a commercial real estate broker from Mississauga, with a firm handshake and a habit of talking over people at dinner. I had never warmed to him. But Patricia always told me I was too hard on him, that he was just ambitious, that ambition wasn't a crime. Ivy and Spencer had 2 kids, a nice house in Oakville, and what I thought was a comfortable life, but money has a way of showing you things about people that ordinary life keeps hidden. The moment Patricia passed, something shifted in my daughter that I didn't recognize. The warmth I'd known my whole life. The girl who used to bring me tea when I was working late in the garage. The woman who held my hand in the hospital and told me everything was going to be okay. She was still there on the surface. But underneath, something had changed. It started with small things. Spencer began asking questions about the estate, casual questions, the kind you could brush off as just curiosity. How long would probate take? Was the house in Patricia's name alone or both names? Did I know the account numbers offhand? I told him I didn't know the details yet, that the lawyer was handling everything. He nodded and smiled and changed the subject. 2 days after the funeral, Ivy came to the house alone. I made her coffee. We sat at the kitchen table where her mother and I had sat 1,000 times, and she looked around the room the way people look at things they're already calculating, and she said, "Dad, I want to talk to you about the will." I told her we'd find out together when we met with the lawyer. She said, "I already spoke with him." That surprised me. When? A few days ago. Spencer reached out to him. We just wanted to understand the process. I let that sit for a moment. "And, Dad, the house is part of the estate, which means it's part of my inheritance." She said it gently, but she said it. "Spencer thinks it might make sense for you to look at something smaller. A condo, maybe. There are some really lovely retirement communities in Hamilton. You'd have people around." I was 67 years old. I had lived in that house for 24 years. I had built the deck in the backyard with my own hands. Patricia's rose bushes were still along the south fence. I told Ivy I needed some time to think. She said, "Of course, Dad. Take all the time you need." Spencer called me the next morning. I want to be fair when I describe what happened over the next 2 weeks, because I've gone over it so many times that I sometimes worry I've made it worse in the retelling. But the truth is, it was bad. Spencer started calling every 2 or 3 days, always polite, always framing things as being for my benefit. Wouldn't I be happier somewhere without all the upkeep? Didn't the yard feel like too much work for one person? Wasn't it a lot of house for just me? And Ivy. I don't know how much Spencer was driving it, and how much was her own fear, her own grief twisted into something else. But Ivy started to echo him. She started talking about the house like it was already hers, mentioning which furniture pieces she'd keep, asking if I had any attachment to the dining room set. One evening she came by and walked through the house while I was making supper, and I could hear her in the upstairs hallway, just walking around. When she came back to the kitchen, I asked her what she was doing. "Just looking," she said. I put down my spoon and looked at my daughter. "Ivy, this is still my home." She had the grace to look uncomfortable. "For now, Dad. But we need to be practical." That was the word that told me everything. Practical. Not kind. Not careful. Practical. A week later, Spencer called and told me they'd found a one-bedroom condo unit in a retirement community in Stony Creek. He'd already spoken to a real estate agent about listing the Burlington house. He said it in the same tone you'd use to tell someone you'd booked a restaurant reservation. Done. Efficient. Moving forward. I said very quietly, "Spencer, I have not agreed to sell this house." There was a pause. Then he said, "Hugh, with respect, the house is Ivy's now. It was in Patricia's estate. We're just trying to help you with the transition." I hung up the phone. I sat down at the kitchen table. And for the first time since Patricia died, I cried. Not because I was sad, though I was, but because I was sitting in the house I'd lived in for 24 years. The house with the deck I'd built and the rose bushes along the fence, and my daughter and her husband were treating me like a problem to be relocated. I called my wife's lawyer the next morning. His name was Mr. Delacroix. He'd handled Patricia's legal affairs for over 15 years. He was a quiet man, the kind who measured his words carefully, and when I told him what had been happening, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. "Mr. Harlow," he said, "I think you should come in, and I think you should bring Ivy and Spencer as well. There are aspects of your wife's estate that we haven't fully discussed yet." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Patricia was very thorough, more thorough than most people realize. We met on a Thursday morning. Ivy wore a blazer. Spencer brought a notepad which struck me as almost funny. Mr. Delacroix welcomed us into the boardroom and set a folder on the table, and we all sat down and he began. He reviewed the basics first. Patricia's estate had a total value of approximately $1.4 million, including the Burlington house, the investment portfolio, and a small life insurance payout. He explained the probate timeline. He went over the executor responsibilities. Spencer was writing things down. "Then, Mr. Colable," Delacroix said, "now, I'd like to walk you through the trust structure." Ivy looked up. "The trust?" "Yes. Patricia established a family trust approximately 3 years ago. It holds the investment portfolio and the insurance proceeds, roughly $890,000 in total assets." Spencer put his pen down. "The house," Mr. Delacroix continued, "was transferred into the trust at that time as well." Ivy said, "I don't understand. The will said I was the primary beneficiary." "You are," he said. "But the trust has conditions." The room was very quiet. He opened the folder and read aloud. Patricia's words, in the careful legal language she and Mr. Delacroix had crafted together, were simple in what they meant, even if the phrasing was formal. Ivy would receive the full benefit of the trust, the house, the portfolio, all of it, provided that her father, Hugh Harlow, was permitted to continue living in the family home for as long as he wished. The trust also specified a monthly living allowance drawn from the portfolio interest, enough to cover my expenses and then some, to be administered independently regardless of what Ivy chose to do. If, however, Ivy or her spouse took any action to remove me from the home, pressure me to sell, or diminish my quality of life in any material way, the conditions would be considered violated. In that case, the house and the portfolio would transfer entirely to a charitable trust Patricia had designated, a children's literacy organization she'd volunteered with for years in Burlington. Mr. Delacroix set down the paper. Spencer's notepad was closed. Ivy said, "What does that mean exactly?" Mr. Delacroix looked at her steadily. "It means, Miss Harlow, that the actions taken over the past 2 weeks, the calls to the real estate agent, the discussion of moving your father to Stony Creek, Those actions constitute a condition violation. I've received a letter from the agent Spencer contacted. I have records of the calls. The color left my daughter's face slowly, like water draining from a bathtub. So the house, Spencer started, the house and the portfolio are in the process of transferring to the Children's Literacy Trust as of this meeting. He paused. Your mother anticipated this possibility, Mr. Harlow. She was quite clear in her instructions. I didn't say anything. I looked at my hands on the table. I thought about Patricia sitting with me in this same city 4 years ago, looking at me across the kitchen table and saying, "Don't worry, I've thought about this more than you know." She had. Of course she had. She always did. Ivy called me that night. Spencer did not call. I think he understood that the calls were part of what had undone them. She was crying before she even finished saying my name. Dad, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. I don't know how it got to that. Spencer he was pushing and I went along with it, and I shouldn't have. I should have said no. I should have told him to stop. Her voice broke. I was scared, Dad. Mum was gone. I was scared about money, and Spencer kept saying we needed to be smart about it, and I let him convince me that you'd be fine, that you'd be better off somewhere smaller, and I knew it wasn't true, and I let myself believe it anyway. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear for a long time without speaking. I have to live with what I did, she said. I know that. I'm not calling to ask you to fix it. I needed you to know I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Dad, I said. Ivy, I know. Can you ever forgive me? That's the question, isn't it? The one that doesn't have a clean answer, not at first, not when the wound is still raw. I told her that I loved her. I told her she was her mother's daughter, in the ways that mattered most, even if she'd forgotten it for a while. I told her that grief does strange things to people, and that Spencer's influence had not made it easier. I did not tell her that everything was fine, because it wasn't. Not yet, but I also didn't close the door. The Children's Literacy Trust took possession of the portfolio holdings the following month. The house remained entrusted me as the designated occupant, my living allowance drawn from a small reserved account. Patricia had specifically ring-fenced for exactly this circumstance. Mr. Boeuf Delacroix had explained that she had essentially planned for 2 outcomes, the outcome where Ivy did right by me, and the outcome where she didn't. She had covered both with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. I stood in the backyard that spring, the first spring without her, looking at the rose bushes along the south fence. They needed pruning. I didn't know how to prune roses. That had always been Patricia's thing. But I figured I would learn. I thought about the 38 years. The delivery truck, the plumbing business, the kitchen table where we'd talked about everything, and the kitchen table where I'd sat and cried, and the kitchen table where I'd eaten Ivy's birthday cakes and helped her with her homework and watched her grow up into a person I mostly recognized. I thought about Patricia sitting with Mr. Delacroix 3 years ago, writing a will that was really a kind of love letter. A letter that said, I know you. I know what you need. And I'm going to make sure you're protected even after I'm gone. Spencer and Ivy separated 8 months later. Ivy told me herself over coffee at the kitchen table. She looked smaller than I'd seen her in years and tired, but more like herself. We talked for 3 hours. She cried twice. I made her a sandwich. It's not a tidy ending. Real life doesn't do those, but she comes by on Sundays now, and sometimes she brings the kids, and we sit in the backyard where the roses are learning to come back, and we talk, not about the estate, not about money, just about things. Patricia would have liked that. I think she counted on it. I still think about that kitchen table, not the meeting with Mr. Delacroix, not the moment Spencer put down his pen. I think about the ordinary table where Patricia and I drank coffee for 38 years and talked about nothing and everything. That table is where she told me she'd thought about everything more than I knew. I didn't ask her what she meant. I just assumed she meant the practical things, the accounts, the house. I didn't understand that she was telling me something deeper, that she had seen clearly what I was too close to see, and that she had quietly done something about it. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the trust document. Not the legal language. The fact that my wife, in the middle of her own illness, in the middle of her own fear, had used her clearest thinking to protect someone else. That takes a kind of character. I'm not sure I fully appreciated until she was gone. I've thought a lot about Ivy in the months since, not with bitterness. I'm past that, mostly. But with the honest question of how a person I raised gets to that point, and the answer, when I sit with it long enough, is that grief and fear and the wrong influence at the wrong moment can pull almost anyone sideways. Ivy isn't a bad person. She made bad choices. There's a difference, and I think it matters to say that out loud. Spencer handed her a version of the situation that made greed feel like practicality, and she was scared enough and grieving enough to take it. I've seen it happen to other families. I just never thought I'd see it happen to mine. What Patricia did, what took real wisdom, was plan not just for the good outcome, but for the human one, the realistic one. She didn't write a will that assumed her daughter would always do the right thing. She wrote one that made the right thing the only option with any future attached to it. That's not cynicism. That's honesty about how people work under pressure and the courage to face it instead of hoping it away. And Ivy, what I've watched in her over these past months, is something I find genuinely moving. Coming back to that kitchen table took more from her than people might realize. It's harder to return than to leave. Staying gone is easy. Showing up and sitting across from your father and saying, "I know what I did," that requires something most people avoid their whole lives. She has more of her mother in her than she knew. I'm 67 years old, and I've learned that the things we build, the businesses, the houses, the portfolios, none of that is really the point. What lasts is what kind of person you are when it costs you something to be that person. Patricia was that person every day of her life, and she was still that person in the documents she signed when she was sick and tired and running out of time. I'm still learning how to prune those rose bushes, but they came back this spring. Turns out, they're hardier than they look.